We were talking about the significant medieval Hebrew manuscripts. These are the three, and remember that these are the ones that are used as a foundation for most of the Hebrew Bible editions that have been done in the modern era. The British and Foreign Bible Society established their text on the basis of the British Library Codex Orientalia 4445. It's a minority text. It is not textual critical. It has only a very few small notes. At the bottom of the page, you'll find that from time to time in used bookstores. You'll see it. It's usually in a red hardback cover and looks very different in its organization and printing. But that's what that is based on. So you'll find that Hebrew Bible editions are based upon one of these manuscripts, and then the editors have the responsibility of putting into notes what changes they would make. There are some modern Hebrew Bibles used as translations, Hebrew translations in Israel, that, for example, one is called the Koran edition, not to be confused with the Quran. But some of these editions are translations, and they will appear like they have made changes in the text, but they are viewed as translations, not as a text that is textual critical. It's not an edition of the biblical Hebrew text. It is a translation of the biblical Hebrew text. So watch out for that if you have hold of a different Hebrew text that has different readings internal. It's not based upon a manuscript. It is merely a translation, and sometimes will show the decisions of the translators. In going further with this, just to let you know what some of these look like, this is what the Codex Orientalia 4445 looks like. You can see the Masorah at the top, in the margins, in the middle, in the columns, and at the bottom. And when it's blown up, you can see what it looks like. You can see that middle character there is a lamed with a dot over it, so it is identifying something that has a circule over it as being the only occurrence in the entire Old Testament. And this is beginning Numbers 26, 12 to 27. And verse 19 we have here the sons of Judah, B'nai Yehudah, the sons of Judah were and Onan, and they died, Wayamat. And so it's a readable text, nice looking text. You can see as you look at the photograph here on the right that there looks like a smudge here. I do not know if that is a result of erasure, but you can see an erasure up here at the top left column and an overwriting and flowing into the margin where the scribe had made a mistake and sought to correct it. Yes, sir?
I don't know if you talked about it, but how similar were the handwritings of the scribes? I mean, did they have to go, I'm sure they were trained, but did they have to do extensive, like font training almost? Do you think that's where some of the errors would come, like somebody not being able to read one of the other scribes' handwritings?
Okay, good question, James. The question is, what about the training of the scribes? Did they have a consistent training for the fonts to use? Were they required to use a single style of writing or font? Would they likely make mistakes? The interesting thing of this is there were certain standards set down for the way the font was to look to distinguish one letter from another. But at the same time, they were given a good deal of freedom on exactly what style they would use overall. And there were individual characteristics so that we can actually identify which scribe did which manuscript, even at Qumran. There's distinctive handwriting differences. Even though there is a certain standardization about the form to be used, yet there was enough leeway that you begin to be able to pick out the separate scribes. Could they have misread each other? I doubt it. They were very skilled men of letters and trained to be able to read, and that would probably not be the source of the mistake. Most of the mistakes were probably due to hearing mistakes or sight mistakes. If they were copying a text themselves by themselves rather than having it read to them, they may look to what they're writing and look back and their eye go to the wrong place because they find something similar on the page. If it's being read to them, perhaps they misspell what they hear by spelling a homonym. And there were those cases where it was read and they were expected to produce what they heard in writing. And those were very carefully checked. It appears to be a mixture of both philosophies at Qumran. Okay? This is the Aleppo Codex. Andy, you have a question?
Just by number 19 there, what's on I think it's your right. What's the little subscript there? Down, yeah, there.
Right here?
Yeah.
Okay. The question is, what's the subscript here on this side of the column? That is where an addition is added in that was accidentally left out in order to make it accurate and correct. So there are a number of those type errors. I mean, we see one there, and that is right over here. You can see it in the larger picture right there. And then over here in this column, we have all of this done. And so there are a number of errors here on the same page. And it makes you wonder, you know, of what use was this? Was it ever used in the synagogues formally? This is part of the research that has to be done on these manuscripts. Look at the errors, look at the corrections, find out what type of errors and corrections they are, how accurate were they, and then what use were they given. If there's any history of usage, that needs to be checked on, because we may be looking at manuscripts that were rejected because of these errors. It might be a clue that it's not that dependable and we need to be extra cautious in citing it as textual evidence. We need to be careful that we understand what kind of errors were made by that scribe on that manuscript, and therefore not to allow ourselves to use as a basis of argumentation or choice of text what would be perhaps one of those errors. So a good deal of study has to go into these things. You have to weigh the manuscripts, not count them. Evaluate them, their kind, their value, their quality, and their usage. Yes, sir?
What's at the top of the page?
The top of the page is the Masorah. That's Masoretic notes. These would be probably Masorah Magna, the major Masorah, up here and down here, where the Masorah Parva are in the columns and left and right margins. Question, Sandy?
At what point in time did they begin to use verses or justification?
Okay, at what point in time did they start using verses? The Masoretes began to note verse divisions by means of the Sof Pasuk, those two little diamonds at the end of verses. That would start about 500 AD to 700 AD, somewhere in that time frame for the first time to regularly indicate it. But even in the texts at Qumran, we have sometimes spacing given to indicate a verse, or spacing given especially to indicate a paragraph. Dr. Tom Finley at Talbot, a good friend of mine, has done some work and research on the Isaiah scrolls and the use of the spacing for talking about closed and open paragraphing within the scrolls and comparing it to what we have in the Masoretic text. And also Fred Mabey down there at Talbot now, who got his PhD at UCLA, also has done a lot of work on word dividers and other markings in ancient texts that would indicate the possibility or potential of at least some verse division. There was at least word division. When I went to seminary, I was told that the Hebrew texts were just like the majuscule Greek texts for the Greek New Testament and for the Septuagint. That as there you have capital letters and no breaks between words. It is scriptua continua. It is continuous script. I was told and taught that the Hebrew manuscripts would have been the same way. The evidence is that they were not that way. The Hebrew manuscripts had word dividers. All the ancient Hebrew manuscripts we have, both biblical and extra-biblical, either put space between words or put word dividers, dots or bars, to indicate it. I'll be showing you some after a while. And so that was not a problem. So when some people argue, well, it's a misdivision of the words, and therefore it's a legitimate textual critical emendation, that is on a false premise that it was continuous script. That does occur in Greek manuscripts. We do not yet have any major Hebrew manuscripts, either biblical or extra-biblical, that have that continuous script. The Aleppo Codex, very beautifully organized. Remember, it goes back to AD 930. You can see the burn marks there on the lower left from the destruction in the synagogue fire. You can see the Masorah Magna at the top and the bottom, the Masorah Parva on the right and left margins. You can see that this is a codex, a book form, rather than a scroll. And it was actually sewn here on the left side. You can see that here the poetry of the Song of Moses is put into poetic format. That is not found in some of the Psalm scrolls at Qumran. But here in Deuteronomy 32, we have the poetic format with the bicola the two-part division of the verses divided out equally in the Song of Moses. It's a beautiful manuscript, which is, by the way, available online now. You can go to www.aleppocodex.org, and you can go through and you can thumb through and read. It turns over just like turning pages. And you can zoom in when you want to get in close to the text and see what it is. You can magnify it greatly. It has a magnification system there. A fantastic site to visit. I just added it to my links on my website because it is really superbly done. It has a lot of work yet to be done on it, but it's there, www.aleppocodex.org. No breaks in there, and you'll find it. It's a wonderful tool to have online. A lot of materials now available that way. Saves you a lot of money. So you have to go out and buy a photographic copy of it. For something, this one would probably run around $500 to buy a photograph of the Aleppo Codex. But a fantastic example of the Hebrew writing, very clear. And something to note when you're looking at things like this, watch the lameds. Look at the tails on the lameds. They come up normally high, especially at the top of paragraphs. And in the margins, the high tail on lameds that indicates the small little bottom, that indicates the only occurrences of things. Those lameds will tell you whether or not, at a glance, the manuscript has been properly published in books. I found several manuscripts of the Psalm scrolls that were published backwards, and even some scrolls that were published backwards and upside down. I sent a word to the publishers and pointed out to them that those pictures had been published wrongly, and they sent back corrected photographs for me to add to my collection, and they sent back thank yous, and several publishers sent me extra copies of new books that they had just published as thanks for pointing those things out. So it pays to pay attention and to look and see. All right? This is the Hebrew University Bible Project I mentioned to you earlier, HUBP. This is from Isaiah chapter 7. And starting at verse 9 and going through verse 15. So it includes the text here of, therefore, the Lord himself will give to you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and she shall call his name Emmanuel. And as you look at that and you go through, you have the first textual critical apparatus level has to do with the ancient versions. The Greek Septuagint, the Latin Vulgate, the Syriac Peshitta, the Aramaic Targums are all included there, including the daughter versions of Symmachus, Theodotion, and Aquila. The second textual critical paragraph has to do with rabbinic sources and the Qumran scrolls and evidence. The third, medieval Hebrew manuscripts. The fourth, Masoretic minutiae. This is where they take the accents, where there's variations of accents, key points with regard to the formation of those accents, also the Masora Parva and Masora Magna, and their variations are discussed here. Anything that has to do with the Masoretic text that is minutiae, that has nothing to do at all necessarily with the meaning of the text or any different reading, but just in the way it's recorded. And the information supplied by the Masoretes is discussed here with all the variations in all the other key Masoretic manuscripts. And the fifth and final is in two parts. The right-hand column is all in modern Hebrew. The left-hand column, amazingly, is in English. It's got a lot of abbreviations, but you can see here, hardly to be parsed, coincidental, all of this, there's a number of abbreviations, but it's in English for a change. Up until now, all textual critical apparatuses have been published in Latin or in German or in modern Hebrew, but never in English. So with the Hebrew University Bible Project, they're doing it in English and in modern Hebrew. So it can be checked side by side for accuracy and consistency, and so that the English-speaking world finally has something that they can read without having to know Latin. Yes, Stephen.
We won't see in our lifetime.
The question is this the one you will not see in your lifetime? Yes, this is the one you will not see in your lifetime. It's Isaiah, Jeremiah are downstairs in the library. not the prophets themselves. The HUBP project, all right? I forgot to tell you, we have a crypt down there for the, yes.
Dr. Barrick, if the Lord really doesn't tarry and he comes back, in your view as eschatology, will this project become redundant?
In my view of
will it
eschatology, is this project redundant? No, this project is not redundant. In what they've already done so far in publishing Isaiah and Jeremiah and the minor prophets has added a tremendous tool to what we're studying now.
No, if the Lord does come, will we still need this project?
Oh, well, we still need it. Well, if we're in heaven, we're not going to need anything.
On earth?
If we're still alive. You post-tribulation rapturist?
No. Will the world still need this project?
Will the world still need it?
Yeah. Will they have perfect?
No, the world won't have perfect knowledge. So it's, and there'll still be people coming to Christ even during the tribulation period. And so there's always a need for accurate study of the Word. So yes, I'd say it's a need. And, it has tremendously valuable now for us. Tremendously valuable. And even if it never gets completed, what little we have has been a great advance in helping us. All right? Interesting to mix eschatology with textual criticism. There's a paper for you, Sun Young. Yeah, you've got to write that. OTI project, eschatology and textual criticism. What do they have in common? How does one impact the other? Does that sound interesting? Oh, well, anyway. No, that's a 25-page paper. Because there's so much debate over eschatology. I mean, I had to ask him what his view of the tribulation rapture was here, Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. As we look at that and we go through, we see there is reference here of the versions having to deal with the Ethiopic. And then we have down here on the Masoretic minutia, there's some discussion of the pointing of the article. And in the notes at the bottom, there's a theological notation there that says in the Syro-Palestinian tradition of text, which would include some Aramaic translations and some of the Syriac Peshitta translations, the change of vocabulary to Bethula has been noted. And also Eusebius, in his discussions, his commentary on Isaiah at this location, has an interesting discussion of the debate on this issue in the early church. You thought it maybe was a recent debate or started with G. Gresham Machen? No, this debate goes all the way back into the early church about what this means and what Alma means as opposed to Bethula, and whether this is the prophet's wife or whether this is the virgin who would give birth to the Messiah. How should it be understood? This is a long-standing debate. And it has some very interesting sidelights that sometime we'd have to get into, but don't have time in this class to do so. Leningrad B19A, this is what it looks like, AD 1008. This is Ecclesiastes chapter 5. And that little text over there is where it says to keep your feet still when you come into the house of God. And then this manuscript is very, very different. This is in the British collections at Oxford. And it's Hebrew manuscript E30, and it covers all of Isaiah 7:11 through 9:8. And you say, wait a minute. Certainly that all isn't there. Well, the way it's there is these are all abbreviations. This is some rabbi's crib sheet to help him remember. Perhaps he was a poor rabbi from a poor synagogue. They couldn't afford their own Isaiah scroll, so he went to a rich synagogue, pulled out a manuscript and sat down and began to copy, realizing he couldn't copy the whole thing. Then he abbreviated everything and memorized so that this would give him his clues as to what to say and how to read it, using Palestinian pointing instead of Tiberian pointing and using abbreviations. This line is Isaiah 7:14. And as I blow it up here for you, the red is what's in the text there. Lakain, therefore, is there to get him started. But instead of give, all he has is the tau from give. And from Adonai, just the yod at the end to indicate that. The hey for who, he, himself. Lakim, the kaf, to indicate the second person pronoun, pronominal suffix. Then we'll come back to oath hine in a minute. Ha-alma, just a lamed to remind him. A hey for hara, conceived. The tau at the end of to bear. And then bain wekarat Karat, we'll come back to that as well. Shemo, his name, just the meme, and Emmanuel, just the im, just the with, and the rest is left. So let's consider this other though. There's a meme and a resh for ot hine. If I covered this in OT 603, those of you who had OT 603 can't answer this. Those of you who haven't had OT 603 but have had a little bit of Hebrew, at least a semester or two, can you think of a reason why there'd be a meme there to represent ot, sign, and a resh to represent hine? Can you think of it? Any reason why? No one? Beginning Hebrew students, what's the Hebrew vocabulary word for he saw? Ra'ah. Ra'ah. Resh. Hine means behold, see. So Ra'ah, the resh, is used to remind him of hine here. Now, why the meme for the word sign? In what place in the Old Testament do you read about the most signs being performed by God? The book of Exodus, at what time? The 10 plagues over Egypt. In Egypt, what's the Hebrew name for Egypt? Mitzrayim. Begins with a meme. You get a little bit of insight into this man's psychotic nature, right? I mean, that really takes something there. And then for Bain Kara, nothing was given. He remembers. She gives birth, and his name, Emmanuel, is sufficient for him to remember those two words. So that's why we talk about this being just an abbreviated shorthand version of this. And he could take this back to his own synagogue, stand up, and read this whole section as though he had the full text in front of him, because it was his clues, he was familiar with them, he had memorized the text well enough that this would help him get through the whole thing. Sandy.
Why is Emmanuel two different words? Is it like Ezekiel probably one version?
Because in the Hebrew, Imanu is one word, with us. With us. And it's a preposition plus a pronominal suffix. And el is God, a separate word. So it's not a compound word. When we use it as a compound word, but in Hebrew it's always separate.
It's not a proper noun. Is it?
El is the proper noun, and in context, Emmanuel is being used as a proper noun. But it's a compound that's divided up into two parts. Yes?
And he would remember that it would be she called his name Emmanuel, not he called.
Well, he would know better than that, because it's the Alma who is going to do it. Right. And notice he took the tau at the end of Yoledeth to remind him it's feminine there. So that keeps him in mind that it's going to be feminine all the way through. Well, let's close that off, and we'll go to part 2 and move into another area of study, the Dead Sea Scrolls. I know all of you have had interest in the Dead Sea Scroll finds. During the break, we had a few conversations that dealt with the Dead Sea Scroll finds. It's something you hear a lot about. One of the most important finds in the history of the text of the Old Testament, its development, its transmission, its preservation. A very important thing. One of the greatest catastrophes was that at 50 years after those scrolls were found, they still had not been completely published. And so in the 1990s, there were a group of men who finally got hold of enough of a concordance electronically and of manuscripts and everything else and photographs. They went ahead and illegally published all of the Dead Sea biblical manuscripts in advance, and were taken to court for it, and it was eventually stopped and the publication was withdrawn. But it woke up the scholarly world to the fact that people had these scrolls and were hanging on to them and were not producing. Some men had these scrolls for 50 years, and there were sometimes small scrolls, and they still had not published them. I mean, that's worse than me on my book on Bible translation. I mean, I've only been 4 years in that, and they went 50 years. 50 years from now, I won't even be here. But that's, that was inexcusable. It is keeping evidence back from the scholarly world and from the community as a whole that people needed to see and know about. Jeremy?
I've heard someone suggest before that the reason for that is some of the early dates for some of the books of prophecy would seem to validate. I mean, it's almost like a conspiracy. Is that someone just with conspiracy
Okay,
theory?
good question. Jeremy had heard that perhaps that was because there was thought to be a conspiracy, that some of the scrolls that had not yet been published actually had prophecies or had teachings that would indicate a belief in the Messiah or a reference directly to Jesus. And that was thought. And there were those who thought that was the conspiracy. And in some of the parabiblical, not the biblical, but the parabiblical, those texts that parallel the Bible, that are on the Bible, like commentaries, things like that, there were some texts like that that did deal with the Messiah in more explicit terms than had ever been released. Robert Eisenman was one of the men who got those produced and published finally, and wrote a book that was a commentary on it to demonstrate the viewpoints of the Messiah and the information about the Messiah in the Dead Sea parabiblical literature that had previously been hidden. And so there is some substance to that. But there's nothing that speaks directly about Jesus himself. And there had been some thought about that. There had even been some accusation that some of the scrolls were actually copies of New Testament books and therefore were being hidden and not published. There were some Greek manuscripts found at Qumran, and so that caused a big furor. Well, a lot of that's died down now, and most of those have been demonstrated to be not New Testament manuscripts at all, but excerpts from the Septuagint instead of from the New Testament, like the Gospel of Mark. Yes?
Is one of your textbook mentioned about Roman legion kind of vandalized one of the Qumran caves?
Why doesn't the textbook mention about the Roman legion vandalizing Qumran caves?
Was found with, back in Roman time or after the independence of Israel?
Okay. When were these found? These were found after the independence of Israel, but they were known long before that. Eusebius mentions the presence of scrolls in jars around the Dead Sea. Back long time ago, way back in the early church. It was said, Eusebius said that one of Jerome's Hebrew manuscripts came from one of the jars found near Jericho in a cave. The Roman legions did not evidently do any damage inside the Qumran caves. They did do damage inside of some of the caves at Wadi Muraba'at and Nachal Heber, what we call the Bar Kokhba caves. And that's because some of the Jewish rebels, having some manuscripts with them, hid in those caves, and the Romans trapped them there and sometimes killed them or starved them to death, and then went in and looted and may have damaged some scrolls then at that time. Remember, Josephus himself was in one of those groups in one of those caves. And he remembered what had happened at Masada, I think his was actually, his would be after Masada. So he remembered what happened at Masada about the casting of lots and drawing of lots and killing each other off until the last one has to kill himself. He talked his men into doing the same thing. And when they were all dead, instead of killing himself, he gave himself up to the Romans and became a traitor, eventually became a Roman general, and supplied information for the enemy. He went over to the enemy. And so those caves have a large history that way, and that's where most of that type damage, or at Masada. Masada was pretty well ruined by the Roman legions when they finally got to the top. In their frustration over finding them all dead, they found a couple of women that were left alive who hid and told them what had happened. And they probably looted the place, and they probably destroyed some scrolls or took some scrolls, but there were scrolls found there later. But at Qumran, there's no evidence that I know of in the reading I've done so far of any Roman legion violation of or looting of the caves where the scrolls were kept at Qumran. All right, the finds, we've talked about several of them. Wadi Ed Dalia, north of Jericho. There's some Samaritan legal papyri that have been found there from the 4th century BC. They're non-biblical. At Qumran, that total now should be 200 plus. I read this morning that there are 221 is the latest tally of biblical scrolls found at Qumran. Also, you have Wadi Muraba'at, one of the Bar Kokhba caves, where there are biblical manuscripts, including minor prophets in Hebrew, dating to 70 to 135 AD, minor prophets in Greek at Nachal Hever, a fragment of the Psalms in Hebrew at Nachal Hever, Bar Kokhba letters from the first half of the 2nd century AD, and then Nachal Se'elim, non-biblical papyrus fragments in Greek, and biblical fragments no later than 73 AD at Masada. So when we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're talking about more than just Qumran. And that's why when you look at the way that the scrolls are identified, that's important for you to look at the letters that are used. When it says 1Q, that's for Qumran. When it says 1HEV, that's Nachal Hever. When it says 1MUR, that's Wadi Muraba'at. When it says 1MAS, or if it just says MAS because it wasn't caves there, the number indicates the cave number. There was usually multiple caves in these areas where fragments have been found. So the number indicates the cave number if there are multiple caves. The location is next. Then you have the book given. As you saw in the quiz, the P, the lowercase p, stands for Pesher, meaning commentary, for the commentary on Habakkuk, and things like that. And then you have the superscript letters are given to tell you then which was the first one found, second one found, third one found in a particular cave. So there's a large number of manuscripts, over 800 non-biblical manuscripts, plus over 221 biblical manuscripts, over 1,000 total. This is the Psalm scroll, the first Psalm scroll, notice the superscript A, found at Qumran Cave 11. You have to leave the highway, park your bus, park your car, you have to walk across the plain and climb the hillside to get up to it. The time we climbed up there to the cave, there were ibex on the hillside that were watching us. It was great. It was fantastic. They wouldn't let us get anywhere near them. Make one motion toward them and they took off. But it was a great experience to see the cave and what they found there. This came from that cave. It contains Psalms 93 to 150 plus 8 non-canonical psalms, like Psalm 154, Psalm 155, things like that. No poetic format. No poetic format. Different order. For example, looking at columns 15 to 18, the bottom of each of these columns is destroyed. In the bottom of this, the jar that they were in, it had deteriorated and just kind of biodegraded into this black gooey mass at the bottom. So huge amounts were lost at the bottom of each column. But as you look at it, column 15 has Psalm 135 and Psalm 136. Column 16 jumps 10 verses. There are 10 verses lost, evidently, between the bottom of column 15 and the top of column 16. But then it jumps to Psalm 118. And in Psalm 118, it has verse 1, then 15 and 16, then 8 and 9, and then 29. Then it jumps to 145. Column 17 picks up 145, 6 verses later. And then you have Psalm 154, a non-canonical psalm. This would indicate, and by the way, one of the things you can note in here is if you could see it, the most clear example perhaps is right here. The name of God, Yahweh, here's a better one right here. The name of God, Yahweh, is written in Paleo-Hebrew script by a different scribal hand in specially prepared ink. And the blank was left for his name, and his name was added in everywhere Yahweh occurs. That was a common Qumran practice, and one that we'll note in other contexts as well, even in Greek manuscripts. Jewish Greek manuscripts of the Septuagint will do exactly the same thing using Paleo-Hebrew script to represent the name Yahweh. But it's probably true that this is a lectionary, a collection of psalm readings for a particular worship service or for personal research or for a specific prayer project or hymn project or for a service in the synagogue. It is not a canonical scroll of the Psalms per se. Pentateuch scrolls at Qumran, 18 of Genesis, 17 of Exodus, 13 Leviticus, 6 Numbers, 29 of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy was a favorite text of the Qumran people, the inhabitants there, the Essenes. So those huge amounts, those differences there, that tells you right there, if you add all that up, you've got what, 48, 54, 63, 83 out of 221 biblical scrolls are from the Pentateuch, because you had multiple copies. They called themselves a Torah community. They were sons of the Torah. And so they would emphasize that. Also, what is not told to you here is how many of these manuscripts are in Paleo-Hebrew script. There were 14 manuscripts at Qumran found in Paleo-Hebrew script, the whole manuscript, the oldest form of Hebrew script. It was first thought that those were copies of the Samaritan Pentateuch, but then it was found out that no, that wasn't so, because it didn't have the Samaritan characteristics except for maybe one of the manuscripts. So they went on from there, continued to recheck. And it looks like that they had a preference for maintaining at least one set or several sets of copies of the Torah in the Paleo-Hebrew script, since that was the original script that Moses would have used in writing the Pentateuch. 14 different manuscripts. 12 of the Pentateuch, 2 of the book of Job. 2 of the book of Job. That indicates that they believed that either Moses wrote Job or that they recognized it as being as ancient as the materials in the Pentateuch, for example, in Genesis, as a patriarchal book. And so it's fascinating to observe that. This example is from the first Isaiah scroll found in Qumran Cave 1. And as you look at this, it's Isaiah chapter 53. It is also called St. Mark's Monastery Isaiah Scroll, because that's who has it. That's who has had possession of it, who purchased it originally, and who keeps track of it. Someone has written right over the top of it in English chapter 53 and the verse numbers in red ink. That is done probably on the photograph of it. I'm certainly sure that someone didn't do that on the manuscript itself. All right? It's a very easy to read script. You can see the tails of the lameds up there, and you can tell they're in the right direction and going up, not down, and on the left side rather than on the right side, so no one's reversed the plate. You'll see here the spelling of me'od, much. There's a variety of spellings in the Qumran scrolls. The spelling isn't always consistent, but the vowel sounds are indicated by means of vowel letters. Aleka, upon him or concerning him, or you, excuse me. Notice that since before the Masoretes, there'd be no vowel pointings. So how do you know whether it's upon or with reference to you masculine or with reference to you feminine? They're spelled the same as far as consonants are concerned. They're pronounced differently because of different vowels. But the Qumran scrolls indicate the masculine by adding the hey as the vowel letter for the comments. So that shows that it is second masculine singular. So you see, the Qumran scrolls helped confirm the pointings of the Masoretes. The Qumran scrolls, the oldest of the scrolls, is at least 700 years before the Masoretes began their work. And yet it can be demonstrated that wherever you have vowel letters given and utilized at Qumran, it matches the vowel system that we see in the Masoretes. It's one of the confirmations of the accuracy of the conveying of the tradition by the Masoretes, as well as paragraph divisions by means of spaces that are given. Those match the Masoretic text as well. So the Masoretes have preserved very accurately. Tom Finley down at Talbot, in his conclusion on the Isaiah scroll, said there is virtually no distinction in the text divisions of the Qumran scrolls and the current Masoretic text. Consistency. Every bit of data we find confirms the accuracy and integrity of the Masoretes and the work they performed. Every bit of it. We rarely have anything that contradicts them. Rarely. Go further here. This is the same scroll. Jumping to Isaiah 40, to give you an example of why I believe that these scrolls were, especially this scroll in particular, was not suitable for use in the synagogue. Notice up here at the top, you have some dots underneath udavar and the word. And then you have written above it here an addition that includes 4 dots of its own. That is representing the title Yahweh. Because here is Ruach, Ki Ruach Yahweh, because the Spirit of God, okay? And so you have it written across here, and the addition is so long it goes out here, and it goes down the margin on the side. And notice over here on the right-hand side here, you have another one out in the margin. There are all kinds of errors. And the marginal notation is in a different script, a different hand, a different scribe than wrote the text. So he has noted the problem and written it in to use for instruction. The fact that the dots still exist and that Yahweh has not been written in Paleo-Hebrew script indicates this never was used in the synagogue. Now, up until just this past year, I had no major Hebraist or Qumran expert who agreed with me that this is proof that these texts are discarded texts, as in a Geniza, because they were inaccurate. They're not to be used as the canonical texts that were considered accurate by the people of the time and therefore legitimate for our usage for textual criticism. That we may still use them for textual criticism, but we have to use them with great caution and care because of the degree of error. They were not put there to preserve this for posterity. They were put there as honorable burial and discarding of texts that were not qualified to be used. But this last year, one of our graduates, Seth Adcock, is at Hebrew University. He was getting a course under Emmanuel Tove, the dean of all the Qumran studies, the leader in textual criticism recognized worldwide, and he got an appointment with him and was going to get to talk with him. And he sent me an email. He said, Dr. Barrick, do you have any questions you would like for me to ask Dr. Tove? And I said, yes. I want you to ask about his viewpoint on these scrolls and the potential of there being discards and not being preserved for posterity the way everyone seems to say and present it. So he went in and talked to him, and he got out, and I mean, within 30 minutes of leaving Dr. Tove's office, he sent me an email. He was very excited. He says, yes. He said, Dr. Tove says you've got it right. That's got to be considered. That's probably what occurred. And my question again is then, if that's right and Dr. Tove agrees, why hasn't anyone written? Even Dr. Tove hasn't said that in any of his books. Why aren't people saying it? Why isn't it being published? When I was there in 1998 and we were at Qumran, I mentioned this, and Todd Boland said to me, he says, I've had a lot of people here on the tours that have come from the Master's Seminary, Master's College, from Dallas and from elsewhere. He said, I've been on a lot of tours, I've seen a lot. He said, I've listened to a lot of tour directors here at Qumran. He says, you're the very first one that I've heard mention this possibility. But gentlemen, it has to be. We went from there later to Jerusalem and went to the scroll of the book. And I just took Todd Boland by the arm, and we walked the whole length of the entire photographic reproduction of the scroll. And I pointed out every single instance of this, and everywhere where Yahweh is missing and just the dots are there in the body of the text, not just in this place where it's an addition. And I just asked him a question after showing him all that. I said, now Todd, tell me, do you think this was ever used in the synagogue or legitimate for the synagogue? And he said, absolutely not. He said, I don't know why I never saw that before. This, to me, is proof that we need to be very cautious about how we play up the role of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the readings of our texts. When the Revised Standard Version came out in 1952 and 1956, it was the first English translation to take into account the findings of the biblical manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They emphasized Isaiah because they were the first to be found, and they were very complete, and they were very impressive, and they started making changes in the translation and the biblical Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, on the basis of these scrolls immediately. Sometimes just in notes, footnotes, but other times in the body of the text itself. Now we've come back from the brink of that. We become far more cautious of how we treat it. All the translations and versions are careful. Even NIV, which tends to be extreme at times and lacks care, have evidently used people that didn't know Syriac, because the evidence in 50% of the time when they talk about the Syriac Peshitta does not match the Syriac Peshitta at all. The Septuagint they give preference for above the Masoretic text. Those are just some of the problems of the NIV. But they're very much more cautious about the use of the Qumran text than the old RSV had been. The new RSV is very much more conservative in the way they treat the material from the Qumran text. There's a sea change, and I think it will last. It will not change. Yes?
How many of the Qumran texts would you say have this problem?
A large number of them. Exactly how many, I would have to depend upon Dr. Tove to say, who's the only man I know of who's done a thorough, detailed analysis of all the biblical scrolls. And I would have to get that figure from him to really have a dependable figure. I haven't seen them all myself, so I couldn't tell you. I've not even looked at all the photographic evidence. At one time I was given a set of all the photographs of all the biblical scrolls up until, I think, 1968. And they were old photographs, they were hard to read, but someone was very generous and gave them to me. And when I left as a missionary to Bangladesh, I decided they were too valuable to take with me. And so I built a special shed for all my books and everything else we were leaving at home, all our valuables. I built a special container with a plastic sealed, zip seal and everything else on it, put it inside of a box, taped it all up and everything else, and put it in the very middle of all the boxes in that shed when I left for Bangladesh, and left it in the care of my brother-in-law and my sister. And then they moved from Wyoming to Utah. And he had an uncle who had a ranch on the outside of Casper, Wyoming, and the uncle allowed him to set up the shed out there, but they took the shed, they set it on particle board in the middle of a horse corral. And wouldn't you know, the winter before we returned home on furlough, the worst winter storms and blizzards happened, and the snow blew in the door, and it so happened that the very first box inside the door was the one that I had labeled to be put in the middle of everything, and it was black. It reminded me of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Turned to black goo. And I lost a 1722 edition of John Gill's commentary on the Song of Solomon in that specially protected box, because the cold weather cracked the plastic and rubber that I had wrapped it all in and taken care of, and lost those photographs of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were done by Sukenik originally. And so that's the way things go. You talk about how do texts get lost? What happens? Same thing that happened to my baseball cards when I was a kid. Went off to college, came home, and my mother threw them away. You know? You just never know. And that's why we have to keep searching then. That's why we have a problem about autographa. They didn't last. They didn't survive mothers, blizzards, and everything else, right? Okay? So, all right. We've got about 6 more minutes left here. The types of differences between the second Isaiah scroll found at Qumran Cave 1 and the Codex Leningrad B19a. What are the differences? 107 in orthography. That means in spelling. Differences in spelling, like the spelling of Mayod. No change in word, no change in meaning, just changes in spelling, 107. That's not a material difference. Addition of a conjunction wow, and. 16 additions of and. It depends on where they're put, whether they make any material difference in the meaning. But if I remember right, in reading through some of these lists, these didn't make any difference. The lack of the conjunction wow, it's elimination in 13 cases. Same thing, no major differences or changes. The article being added or omitted, 4 such cases of addition or omission. 10 differences in consonants. Now that can make a very big difference if it gives you a totally different word. But if it's a change between a psalmic and a scene, it's the same sound, and it could be a variant spelling. It could be truly orthographic, even though it involves the idea of a change in consonants. Sometimes there are similar sounding vocabulary or roots that have basically the same meaning, even though they're listed in the lexicon under 2 different headings. Missing letters. This could affect something. 5 times only, and this is the entire book of Isaiah, 66 chapters. You can look in the Masoretic Finalis to find out how many verses that involves. The differences in number, like between dual or plural or singular. 14 differences. That could make a difference in meaning. Differences in pronouns, as opposed to a second person to a first person or third person. Different grammatical forms, 24. That could be anything from lamed on an infinitive construct and a lamed not being there. It could be a hey on the end of an imperative as opposed to not having a hey on the end of an imperative. It could be changed from perfect to imperfect. It could be changed from a participle to a perfect. Different prepositions. 9 times there are different prepositions where maybe instead of lamed it was al, or instead of al a lamed. Different words entirely. There are 11 such cases. In those 11 cases, none of them make a major impact on the text and change it so radically that it would affect doctrine or affect what the text is saying or the ultimate outcome or meaning of the text. It does do something a little bit different, though. Omission of words. 5 times there are words that are omitted in 1 Qumran Isaiah B that are found in Codex Leningrad B19A. And 6 times words are added. 6 times words are added. And a different sequence, a different word order, 4 times only. Now, out of 66 chapters, those are very minor and very few. The major ones that make a difference in numbers and make a difference in meaning are those that I put inside the red boxes. And in all of those, if you study them, if you were to categorize them, catalog them, and go through them, as one fellow by the name of Rosenblum did, you find very few changes in the message of the prophet or in the doctrines that would be affected or might be affected. Very little. I believe, if I remember right, Rosenblum summarized that he felt that in the entire book of Isaiah, Isaiah Qumran scroll, Isaiah B, the second one found of Isaiah, probably had a total of 6 what he called material variants, where it had a significant change in meaning, but he felt that it was not so significant it affected the message of the prophet nor any doctrine. And that's pretty minor. That speaks pretty loudly to the consistency, again, of the Masoretic text when you compare it here to a text that has problems. The second text found at Qumran does not have all the problems the first text had. The first text has all those additions. The second text is far cleaner, does not have all those scribblings in the margins and all the mistakes. It contains the name Yahweh written in. It gives every indication it may have been used in the synagogue at one time. And it may have been in the Geniza because it got worn out, because it's not all there. There's certain parts that are damaged that may have been damaged prior to that. We don't know. Rosenblum actually thinks that this is a translation rather than an exact text. He believes it's an updated translation in the Hebrew of the time of the book of Isaiah. If he is correct in that, his argument is that the variations between the Masoretic text and this translation would have no bearing whatsoever on the text and would support the Masoretic text 100%. Because the differences in vocabulary, omissions of words, additions of words, different grammatical forms, and other things that would affect meaning would be interpretive or due to translational theory and practice rather than trying to preserve and transmit a text. And that is still being debated. And it has been classified as a scroll that is it's proto-Masoretic in nature. It doesn't support the Septuagint, and that it is put as a question mark of whether or not this should be filed. In fact, Emmanuel Tov has now currently put it under the special category of Qumran-style texts, which meant free translation, paraphrase, and additions because of a use other than preserving the text, such as a translation would be used. Not for formal use in the synagogue when reading the scriptures, but for use in study, for use in instruction, things of that nature. So this is still a debate that has not been closed and will continue for some time.